Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 4 of 6 of the Sharks preseason. This time, the Sharks lose 4-1 to the Anaheim Ducks. Now a fantastic 0-4 in the preseason as a whole, which of course doesn't really matter for the regular season, but it is still getting a bit tiring to see the Sharks lose. Once again, the Sharks decide to field mostly a rookie lineup. It seems as though in their 5th and 6th preseason games, the Sharks will go with a more complete lineup. So this was a nice last look at some of these Sharks rookies. So I had made a video saying that the Sharks had cut a good bunch of players. A few of them were brought back up to play this game. You know, players like Chekhovich, Chmelevski, Gregor. They are likely to return to the Barracuda, especially after the performance in this game, which all around for the Sharks, besides the start of the first and a few minutes in the third, was quite pitiful. So taking a look first at the first line, it was a Meier, True, and Gambrell line. These three players have a decent amount of potential to be able to make the team out of training camp. Alex True may be a bit on edge. Meier, of course, will be there. Gambrell likely to as well. Meier was probably still the best player for the Sharks, which is not really surprising, although it's also not saying much as Meier himself wasn't that great. True had a few good moments, at least defensively. His offensive play was okay. Gambrell looked decent as well. He had a very nice pass on the Brodzinski goal, the only Sharks goal of the game, and a couple of other decent plays, but otherwise was kind of average. The second line of Chekhovich, Chmelevski, and Redil was pretty disappointing for the majority of the game, and I have to say that the most disappointing Sharks young rookie player of the entire training camp has to be Sasha Chmelevski. Through the rookie games, the rookie tournament games, now into the preseason, he has done absolutely nothing to really stand out for me. It's not necessarily that he's been bad, although he has had some bad moments, but he just really hasn't stood out at all. And Chmelevski came into this camp potentially as a front runner to be able to fill a spot on the Sharks roster and potentially even push for a top 6 spot that we know the Sharks do have open, and yet it has been a complete disappointment. Hopefully he'll get he'll be in the AHL next season, which he will, and it'll really help him get back on track, because it was sort of a step back here in this training camp in my eyes. Chekhovich wasn't as disappointing, I'd say, even if he was also a front runner who will not be making the team, at least out of camp this season, but he did have a couple of solid moments. His game tonight, his defense was kind of bad, but at least his offense, he had a couple of moments. Redil himself, who has actually had a pretty solid preseason, also looking a bit shaky in this game. The next line was Gaudreau, Suomela, and Brodzinski. Brodzinski had a couple of moments, especially, of course, his goal being the only Sharks goal of the game. He is still likely to be a player making the Sharks out of camp, especially since he isn't necessarily a rookie. He does have a decent amount of NHL experience, about 60 or so games, so he should be making it out of camp and likely will find himself on the second or third line, I'd guess. Suomela also looked pretty solid in this game, nothing spectacular as it was with most of the Sharks players. And Barclay Goodrow similarly looked okay. On the fourth line, Blichfeld had maybe 1 or 2 moments, but otherwise found himself a bit lost on the ice multiple times. Noah Gregor, I thought, actually was probably the best of the Sharks rookies who had been cut and then called back up. When you take a look at Chekhovich, Chmelevski, Blichfeld, I thought Gregor actually had a decent game with a couple of solid moments. A player who I would not be surprised if he was to be sent back down to the Barracuda, and he will be on the Barracuda to start the season, let's say. I would not be surprised if Gregor is maybe the first or the second call-up if the Sharks do sustain an injury on their main roster. And then finally, VL didn't really stand out to me in any which way. It's not like he had a bad game, but he was not impressive at all, so I suspect he will also be returning to the Barracuda. On defense, this is where it was a bit of a breakdown in this game. The pairing of Middleton and Heed, this pairing has found itself together multiple times in the preseason, and both players have been extremely disappointing in my eyes. Middleton in particular, he was a player who was seen as sort of a backup defenseman for the Sharks this past season. He was the 9th guy after Ryan, Shemek, and Heed. Then with the departure of Ryan, Shemek is injured. Middleton could have potentially been the 7th defenseman to start the season. season, but he has just been so disappointing. He wasn't someone who was expected to have much of an offensive game, but his defensive game has looked extremely shaky at best, and that makes me think he may have fallen down the depth chart somewhat here. And Tim Heed as well has been disappointing throughout the entire preseason. This was a chance Tim Heed with the signing of Joakim Ryan to the Kings. The Sharks let him go, and Justin Braun having been traded, Tim Heed had the chance to become the sixth defenseman for the Sharks. It's likely the reason he re-signed even as a UFA with the Sharks, because the Sharks potentially promised him a spot in the top six, but he's really playing his way out of that role, and it's likely he still starts the season with the Sharks, I'd say, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him finding himself as a healthy scratch potentially once again this season, because this preseason has just been so poor for Tim Heed that you really were expecting a lot more from him, and he maybe is like the Joakim Ryan of this season. The next pairing, Ferraro and Prout. Ferraro continues to be such a firecracker on the ice. Not necessarily the Sharks' best player on any given night, although that first game in the rookie tournament obviously stands out as a fantastic game. But it's just so nice to see Ferraro really giving it his all on every single shift. Not to say that some of these other players were slacking off, but you could almost say that if you didn't know, let's say Shemalevsky or Chekovich were those specific numbers, you could say that those are maybe 10-year veterans who already know they're going to make the team, even though they should be fighting for a spot. Ferraro, you definitely can't mistake that. He was really putting in the effort, and so while sometimes it didn't work, sometimes there were defensive misplays, he does show a lot of promise, and as some people are predicting, he could find himself on the Sharks roster to start next season. Dalton Prout has gotten a good amount of preseason time. He ended up taking a major penalty and getting a game misconduct in this one. He was also quite subpar defensively. People are also, talking about how potentially Prout could start, and this is a bit worrying for the Sharks, as Prout, Heed, and Middleton have all been quite subpar in the defensive department throughout this preseason, and so you obviously have Karlsson, Dylan Burns, and Vlasic to fall back on as a top four, but with Shemek injured, you need a couple of guys to step in, and a lot of the main candidates here have looked quite subpar. Past Ferraro, you're looking at one of Prout, Heed, and Middleton, as I said, who haven't been good, and otherwise, who are you trying to put into the lineup? It seems as though you likely will have one of these three players playing at a pretty low level. You'd really have to hope for that they can overperform what they did in the preseason, and this was just a small blip. Finally, the last pairing, Dylan and Knyzhov. Dylan, not really a point of evaluating his performance. Knyzhov has not really been all that impressive throughout the entirety of this preseason. That continued here tonight. I'm surprised he's actually gotten so much time, as I'm not necessarily impressed with what he's actually done, but not really the point here. Finally, the goaltender, Aaron Dell, actually had himself a pretty solid game, all things considered. Yes, he did let in 3 goals, but he made a lot of key saves. And as I said, the Sharks' defense was actually quite pitiful throughout the majority of this preseason game versus the Ducks. And so Aaron Dell was forced to make a lot of good saves. There were a couple of rebounds that were pretty suspect, and a couple of moments where you were saying, oh, that looks like the Dell from last season. But seeing him play in this game, seeing his preseason game earlier on, I believe also against the Ducks, if I'm not mistaken, does give me hope that Dell will have returned potentially to 2 seasons ago form and not play at the form he was at in this past season, where he was one of the worst backups in the league. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, preseason game number 5 versus the Calgary Flames. As I said, the Sharks will likely have a good chunk of their main lineup playing in that game. Maybe we'll finally see Erik Karlsson in the lineup. He's one of the very, very few Sharks who hasn't actually gotten a single game. Couture found himself playing one, Burns, Vlasic, even Joe Thornton, Hertl, Kane. They've all played preseason games, at least one, even Jones has as well. Karlsson is one of the very few, if not the only one, who has not played a single game. I don't know if that is any way related to the groin injury he had at the end of last season, or if it's just, a coincidence that this is the case, but we likely will see him against the Calgary Flames, and we'll see what his form is in that game. Class dismissed.